In my earliest memories, my father was already a man with regret etched into every crease of his face. I remember watching him at the dining table, swirling his coffee in a chipped mug as if searching for answers in the whirlpool of milky liquid. Even before I was old enough to understand the conversations happening around me, there was always a strained tension in our home. My mother, Anne, would quietly tiptoe around him, offering him endless cups of tea or watching him from behind the kitchen counter. I never grasped it then, but now, looking back, I see the unspoken accusation simmering in his eyes. He blamed me, a child, for something I never asked for, my own birth. Apparently, I had single-handedly dismantled his comfortable life long before I could even speak. He was married once before he met my mother. His first marriage, from what I heard, was a picture of normalcy in a suburban neighborhood, a neat house, weekend barbecues, and vacations that promised a bright future. Then my mother got pregnant with me, and that scandal blew apart their world. The story came to me in fragmented whispers, hush-hush arguments, broken confessions from my mother on nights when she couldn't hide her tears, and an angry hush whenever my father stormed through the house. I pieced it together over time. My father's ex-wife discovered my mother's pregnancy, and soon the marriage fell apart. My father always insisted that I, not his own actions, was the true culprit behind the collapse. Even as I grew older, the wedge between us grew impossible to ignore. One of my earliest clear memories was coming home from kindergarten, tears rolling down my cheeks after another child teased me. My mother knelt beside me in the living room, cradling my face and whispering assurances that I was loved. Nearby, my father hovered in the doorway, arms crossed, his gaze averted. That night, I heard him say to my mother in a sharp whisper, "You coddle her too much. She's the reason everything fell apart, and you still give her all of your sympathy." He spoke about me as though I were a burden, a shadow he couldn't get rid of. I tried to win him over with school drawings or timid gestures of affection, but he only responded with cold shrugs. On rare occasions, if I pushed him for attention, he'd grumble something about how some mistakes can't be undone. I was too young to truly comprehend it. All I felt was a constant undercurrent of guilt, like I needed to apologize for existing. In my teens, I discovered he had another child, a daughter named Lillian. Their photos lay hidden in a dusty shoebox in the garage. In those pictures, my father's smile was wide, his eyes were bright. He posed proudly beside Lillian, who gleamed with trophies or awards. He never smiled like that for me, not once. My attempts to ask my mother about Lillian were met with half-hearted explanations. She said Lillian had stayed with her own mother after the divorce and had little to do with us. Over time, I learned Lillian despised me just as much as my father did. From her perspective, I was living evidence of her father's betrayal. Still, life pressed on. I was determined to excel. If I couldn't earn my father's love, maybe I could at least gain his respect. In high school, I stacked my schedule with extracurriculars, debate club, volunteer work, a part-time job. My mother proudly attended my events, cheering me on, while my father sat stiffly in the background, if he bothered to show up at all. After my high school graduation, he offered me a limp handshake, like a coworker forced to make small talk. When it was time for me to leave for college, I chose a university 3 hours away. My mother was emotional, hugging me in the driveway. My father barely looked at me, mumbling something about my car's oil. The disappointment stung, but a small part of me was relieved to finally escape his unyielding gaze. College felt like fresh air. Free from the tension at home, I found myself flourishing academically and socially. I made close friends who knew me for who I was, not for whatever baggage my father had placed on my shoulders. I dated casually at first, unwilling to attach myself to anyone too deeply, until I met Jacob. He was a law student, a year ahead, with an easy laugh and a comforting presence. We connected effortlessly, sharing late-night study sessions and weekend picnics beneath leafy trees. Over time, I told him about my father's resentment, half expecting pity. Instead, Jacob offered empathy. He didn't try to fix the past, he simply listened and let me unburden myself. By my senior year, I realized I wanted to spend my life with him. A month before graduation, he proposed under the shade of a willow tree in a quiet park. It was private and heartfelt. No elaborate productions, just a small box with a ring, his eyes shining with hope. I said yes without hesitation. In that moment, I imagined a future untainted by my father's accusations, a love that was entirely my own. My mother's delight was immediate when I told her about the engagement. She clapped her hands in joy, then stopped abruptly and asked if I'd invite my father to walk me down the aisle. I hesitated, the old ache stirring in my chest. Despite everything, I'd secretly held on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, my wedding would be the turning point. The longing for a father's approval still clung to me, a remnant of childhood need. Jacob saw my turmoil and gently encouraged me to try. If he says no, at least you won't have regrets. So I dialed my father's number, heart pounding. He answered with a curt greeting. When I mentioned my wedding plans, he was silent at first. Then came a cold laugh. "Why would I walk you down the aisle? You cost me my marriage before you were born. I have obligations to my real daughter that day." His words stabbed like daggers. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying not to cry as he poured out his bitterness in clipped sentences. "You're the mistake," he added. "Don't ask me to pretend otherwise." Then he hung up. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my cheeks, phone still in hand. My mother found me there, and I told her what he had said. Jacob arrived soon afterward, held me tightly, and whispered, "Let him go." I tried to follow that advice, but the hurt cut deeper than I expected. I'd foolishly imagined there might be some spark of fatherly pride on my wedding day. Instead, he confirmed the worst of my fears. I was nothing to him. We pushed forward with the wedding plans. My mother offered to walk me, but I refused. I wanted to walk alone, with my head held high to symbolize that I had never truly needed him. This was my day, and I wouldn't pretend otherwise. My mother looked pained, but respected my decision. The morning of the wedding was bright, sunlight streaming into my childhood bedroom. I felt an unexpected calm while slipping into my ivory gown. My friends helped me with my veil, giggling and telling me how beautiful I looked. Even as my heart clenched at the thought that my father was elsewhere, probably doting on Lillian, I remained resolute. If he couldn't be bothered, I wouldn't spare another tear. When the soft strains of music began in the garden behind the chapel, I took a deep breath and started down the aisle alone. My mother cried in the front row, and Jacob watched me with so much love in his eyes that my knees almost went weak. My guests fell silent, sensing the significance of my unaccompanied walk. Step by step, I felt my independence reaffirmed. I didn't need my father's hand. I could carry myself. The ceremony was beautiful. Jacob and I exchanged vows with trembling voices. We kissed to loud cheers, and the reception began under strings of fairy lights. We danced, and for a while I forgot my father's absence in the swirl of celebration. Then, during a quiet moment, my phone buzzed. I ducked into a corner to check it. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered. The caller identified herself as Mary, a neighbor of my father's. She apologized for calling on my wedding day, but said she thought I should know. My father had been hosting a small family gathering to celebrate Lillian's successes, and he drank too much. Eventually, an argument erupted between him and Lillian over the past, over me, over his failure as a father, and he ended up stumbling outside. An ambulance was called when he collapsed. "They took him to the hospital," she said. "I'm sorry if this ruins your day. I just thought you deserved to know." The news jolted me. Anger, confusion, and guilt warred inside me. Despite everything, he was still my father. But then I remembered his hateful words, that dismissive tone. I pictured him sneering, calling me a mistake. Was I really going to let him overshadow the happiest day of my life? I inhaled deeply, tears pricking my eyes. I thanked Mary, hung up, and slid my phone back into my purse. My mother soon noticed my rattled expression, and I told her what happened. She squeezed my hand, asking gently if I intended to go to him. I shook my head, voice trembling. "No," I whispered. "He chose where he wanted to be today." Jacob found me shortly afterward, concern written on his face. When I told him the situation, he pulled me into a quiet hug and said, "You deserve this moment. Let's not let him take it away." I nodded, wiped my tears, and returned to the reception, determined to enjoy what was left of the night. My father had made his choice, and I would make mine. We flew out for our honeymoon the next afternoon, heading to a peaceful beach resort. For 2 glorious weeks, I allowed myself to forget that I even had a father. Jacob and I wandered white sands, snorkeled among colorful fish, and danced under star-dappled skies. Each day, the tension in my chest eased. Yet, at the edges of my mind, I couldn't fully banish images of my father alone in a hospital room. When we returned home, we were greeted by my mother's anxious voice on our answering machine. She reported that my father was stable, but that his outburst had caused a rift with Lillian. It seemed Lillian was furious with him for dredging up old resentments when he was supposed to be celebrating her. She left abruptly after accusing him of living in the past. "He's calling her ungrateful," my mother's recorded voice said, "and he's still ranting about you." A strange mixture of sorrow and triumph rippled through me. For the first time, he was facing real consequences for his bitterness. I felt guilty for the flicker of satisfaction, but after years of being his scapegoat, it was impossible to ignore that tinge of vindication. He'd spent so long blaming me, he never saw how his own behavior could repel everyone around him. As Jacob and I settled into our routine, I noticed a growing sense of detachment from my father's fate. When my mother hinted that he might welcome a visit, I refused. I finally had a life of my own, and I would no longer extend the olive branch. My mother looked pained, but she couldn't change my mind. I told her I had no regrets. He had shut the door on me more times than I could count, and I was done trying to pry it open. Then, strangely, Lillian reached out to me online. She sent a message asking to meet. My curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed. At a downtown cafe, we both arrived on edge, unsure how to interact. Lillian was tall, elegant, and had our father's intense eyes. She was up front. "He's driving me insane. Every time we talk, he won't stop ranting about you, about my mother, about everything." I listened quietly, sipping my latte. "He blames me for his divorce," I said, my voice flat. "He always has." Lillian sighed, tapping her manicured nails on the table. "I used to think you were the reason he left us. I hated you, even though we never met. But after what he said to me recently..." She shook her head. "He's the one who made those choices, and now he's paying for them." I nodded, a strange kinship fluttering between us. We both were victims of his bitterness, each hurt in different ways. She confessed part of her had wanted a sister, but had been too angry to reach out. I realized I, too, had once imagined a sisterly bond. We talked for a while, sharing stories that might have been funny if they weren't so tragic. When we parted, we exchanged a guarded smile. We weren't exactly friends, but we were no longer enemies. Months passed. My mother told me my father's health had deteriorated. The same hardness that drove him to lash out had also driven away any sense of community or support. Lillian had stepped back from him, tired of his raging blame. I felt a pang of empathy. He was alone, his pride battered. But I remembered all the times he refused to see me as his child. I had no desire to revisit that pain. One sweltering summer evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was a lawyer's office. My father had died from a heart attack, his final days marked by declining health. My throat tightened, my mind reeling. Part of me expected to feel deep sorrow, but what rose up instead was a confusing mix of relief, anger, and sadness. The lawyer mentioned I was named in my father's will. That shocked me more than the news of his death. Why would he leave me anything when he'd always insisted I was his greatest regret? On a humid afternoon, I found myself sitting in a sterile law office with Lillian. We acknowledged each other silently. The lawyer read the will. Lillian would inherit my father's house and debts. To me, he left a small cabin near a remote lake, a property I'd never heard of. The lawyer then handed us each sealed envelopes. My heart pounded as I opened mine and recognized my father's handwriting. The note read, "You took everything I ever cared about. Here, have this too. No apology, no closure, just one last barb from beyond the grave." I blinked away tears, turning to see Lillian reading her own note, eyes full of hurt. We stepped outside under the blazing sun, both stunned by the cruelty. She muttered a goodbye and left. That night, I drove out to see the cabin. It stood by calm, dark waters, the twilight sky streaked with pink and orange. The air was hushed, except for crickets chirping. I stood on the porch, every nerve alert. The lake's reflection shimmered in the fading light, and I felt my father's hateful energy trailing me. Yet, for the first time, I sensed I had the power to turn his bitterness into something else. After a few months, I sold the cabin. I used the proceeds to help pay off my mother's lingering bills and, more importantly, to start a small scholarship fund in my own name, targeted toward young adults caught in the crossfire of broken families. I wanted to transform his final insult into a force of good. Each time I contributed to that fund, I pictured him sneering in disapproval. But he couldn't stop me now. I had made something worthwhile out of the ashes of his contempt. People sometimes ask if I ever forgave him. The answer is no. He never asked for forgiveness, and he never deserved it. He had countless chances to be part of my life, and he refused them all. In the end, I came to realize that closing the door on him was an act of self-preservation. There would be no teary reconciliation, no father-daughter hugs. Instead, my final act toward him was taking the last remnants of his legacy and reshaping them into hope for someone else. That, to me, was the sweetest revenge. I live my life now with my head high, knowing I am not defined by his bitterness. If there's one lesson I carry with me, it's that a person's cruelty says more about them than about the one they hurt. I still recall my wedding day, walking myself down the aisle, the faint smell of roses, Jacob smiling at me like I was the only person in the world. I remember the hush that fell over our guests and how, for once, I felt stronger than the shadows that had trailed me since childhood. In that moment, I broke free from the narrative my father had written for me. His refusal to walk by my side became a defining symbol. I did not need his arm. I had my own strength. If people ask me about my father now, I tell them the simple truth. He chose pride over love until the very end. And I chose to live, to love, and to move on. The bitterness he cultivated so fiercely never found a home in me. I stood tall on my wedding day, and I stand tall today. My life is my own, shaped by my choices, not by his anger. That is my ultimate victory.